Welcome to the Annie's Project Mitigating Risk Across Common Barriers to Profitability webinar series. Today's program is going to focus on record keeping, a necessary skill, and we're thrilled to have with us part of our Know Your Numbers Northeast team member, Shannon Dill, who's an extension educator with the University of Maryland Extension. And I'll let Shannon introduce herself in more detail here in just a moment or two. I'm Doris Mold, and I am co-CEO of Annie's Project nationally, and we're happy to be part of this program that is brought to us by a grant from USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education Program. We are having a cooperative effort between Annie's Project, Rutgers Cooperative Extension, University of Maryland Extension, and University of New Hampshire Extension. And as I said, this program is for anyone to participate. So we're happy to have so many of you joining us today from across the country. And I'll be working behind the scenes here in just a few moments. I'll take my place behind the scenes and Shannon will take over. But before we get started, we wanted to do a little poll just to see where you were at and kind of get an idea for who's on with us. So when it comes to record keeping, we would like you to respond to this poll. So when it comes to record keeping, how are you feeling? All right, we've got, okay. Just a few more moments. We'll let people come in and be part of our poll here, just to give us an understanding of who we've got joining us today. All right. And again, we're just getting settled in here, just getting started. Welcome for you, those of you that have just entered the room. Just settling down with the poll. We're going to end the poll and share our results here. Well, there's a few of you that are not sure about what you're doing, and I'm sure Shannon's going to help you out there. A few of you say you're beginners. So we've got quite a few that feel that they're somewhat knowledgeable. So they might be asking some more challenging questions, Shannon. We'll see what comes up. And we have one real pro in the room and an uncertain. So we've got kind of the full range. So welcome everybody. Again, we appreciate your willingness to be with us today. And I am now going to turn it over to Shannon. And as you have questions, please put those in the chat box. We will pull those in as needed and definitely try to get those covered before we end today's session. So with that, thank you so much. And here's Shannon.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Shannon Dill, as Doris mentioned, and while I'm a county agent, much of my programming and work has been in the area of farm management. So talking a little bit about record keeping, I just think this is an excellent time of year to refresh, maybe reorganize, clean out. Spring cleaning, you're wrapping up from last year's records and looking forward to this year's production season. So I think this block of time is just a great time of year to sort of get organized, think about the upcoming year, maybe reflect on the previous year. So hopefully I can take you away today with some skills, maybe some tools or resources to use to make record keeping maybe a little more clear, more organized, and be able to make some decisions based on your information. So as Doris said, I'm with University of Maryland Extension. My email is here. I will be sending the slide set, so that will be available as well. I always like to start sort of with this slide when I work in the farm management area. A lot of our programs this time of year focus around crop production, crop updates, pesticide recertification, nutrient management trainings. But I like to add in that good manager side and taking time to brush up. So a big kudos or congratulations to you for joining today to work on that good manager side. So often the crops tend to pull us outside, the animals or work that needs to be done pulls us to do that, but sitting down and carving out time on a regular basis to look at finances, to look at marketing, to make plans, to do some reflections is really helpful, and it's going to help the overall farm profitability. So some objectives today, just talk a little bit about farm records, and then we'll get more in depth into what farm records to keep, personal, production, and financial. And then we'll wrap up with maybe some ways to manage farm records a little better and some tips and tools that I've learned over the years with either Excel or maybe some financial software systems. So record keeping, and I like to say you can really keep records on anything. People are keeping records today on their steps. You know, how many steps did I take around the house? Maybe it's certain records on weather. I have a very close farmer that I work with here in the county that has a weather station. So daily he's taking certain weather measurements. We have poultry producers that are looking at feed efficiency. So they're taking regular readings of their poultry feed and what goes into those diets. So when we talk about record keeping, you can keep records on really anything. What you have to decide is what is maybe necessary as far as a regulatory stance, but then also what would help you be a better farm manager and make better decisions. What records do you need to make better decisions on the farm? So some of us may keep it for proof. This could be perhaps the IRS asking for tax records. Maybe it's your revenue and expenses and inventory. At some point, you may need proof. So having those records is important. I mentioned decision aids. Records really help with making decisions and purchases. And right now we know that the markets are kind of volatile. Supplies are an issue. So being able to have those records and look back and say, you know, this purchase will better the farm, or we can make this purchase, or maybe we need to liquidate some things. So it helps with decision aids. It may be institutional requirements. And again, this time of year is our big record keeping year. I know for crop reporting, FSA, I think reports are due March 15th here in Maryland. Our environmental records were due March 1st for nutrient management. So there may be some institutional requirements through crop insurance or lending agencies that may request that. I know on an annual basis, I have to update a balance sheet for my line of credit for the farm. So that's a requirement from my lender. And then the fourth one here is environmental. And those may be things that are required through our production practices or required in Maryland. We have a couple different environmental reporting requirements based on nutrient management. We have to keep pesticide records, any applications of biosolids or use of irrigation. So there may be some requirements based on that. I also found this quote and I really like it. It's good records do not ensure your farm will be successful. However, success is unlikely without them. So a lot of people say, you know, I have my farm plan in my head. I know what I'm doing. Oh, I know what happened last year. But I do think putting things down on paper and looking at trends over time is very, very helpful in seeing where you can make some changes and really make the farm profitable. In a lot of my financial trainings, I do like to at least touch on the personal side of things, the home. And I think that that's, to me, that's the best place to start to get organized is whether it's a household budget, it's your record keeping system. So for personal records, this is some information from Smead. And I think they're a filing company or maybe it's paper products. But I just found this as a really great outline of what should be kept and how it should be kept. So for your personal records, records to keep and never throw out. So these are permanent records that you need to keep. At my house, I have these in a special box. They're not in the file cabinet. They're not filed with other things. They are in actually a file box that I could grab if I needed to in an emergency or if something was happening. And that's my permanent, my tax records, my legal documents, birth certificates, social security cards, passports, marriage license, all of those things. Any vital records, wills, retirement, and investments. Those are permanent records that you need to keep and not throw out. The next are some business records, and you need some type of permanent file for your financials, your legal document, and your licensing. For tax records, they say a minimum of 6 years. The IRS can go back 6 years for an audit. And so I do think that keeping those at least 6 years is important. I think that keeping them longer term is, having them on a more permanent record would be helpful. For everyday paperwork for 3 years, this is monthly financials. This could be credit card statements, utilities, and medical bills. And then there's some uncategorized ones like your vehicles or equipment. You can keep those until they're sold. For a credit card, at least until you've reconciled them. And for policies and warranties, at least until they expire. I like to have a shredder or use maybe a community shredding service. So for my household, I've got a small shredder that I can use. For our office, we've used some of the banks will offer like a community shredding. But getting some type of record keeping system in the household and knowing where some of these permanent records are to be able to access them are helpful.
Say, Shannon, before you go any further, so for instance, a lot of people in their business, in personal in particular, use credit cards and things like that. It says, 3 years for the everyday paperwork, but maybe some of that would actually be necessary for tax record too. So how do you kind of figure out what you should be keeping just in case the IRS wants to come back and audit you?
Absolutely. And I think that, the filing system, I think, does get more complicated too when, some bills or invoices I don't even get by paper anymore, right? So I access my credit card statement is all online, it's paperless. So I can go back even further. I think that having those credit card statements, especially if you've got farm expenses, personal expenses, if you've got those split, is probably easier to keep. For the farm expenses, you could print them off and keep those in, I think, a separate file compared to your personal records. So for the personal records, unless there's something on the credit card statement that either relates to the business or you would need proof for the IRS, maybe it's medical, things that you're deducting or other payments that you could actually deduct from a personal standpoint. Other than that, if it's on the farm side, I like to print it off, and especially because I do categorize expenses. So if I have my farm credit card, I would have, say, fertilizer, repairs, I would try to categorize those on that billing statement. So here is just kind of a summary of records that you could be keeping. Maybe I suggest keeping, depending on your farm and your enterprises. Having some type of household and those personal records, enterprise budgets, balance sheet, cash flow, production schedule, your production records, sales records, maybe keeping an inventory, assets, and then your customers, vendors, and marketing. And we're going to kind of break these down, but this is just sort of a big summary of the types of records that farms may need to or want to keep. So in keeping farm records, there's 3 basic ones that we can divide into groups. The first is resource inventories. The second is production accounts, or that could be your livestock, your crop, if you have a value-added enterprise, those kind of growing and sales accounts. And then the third are your financials, so your income and expense records, those financial side. We start off with the resource inventories. This one is, don't like to call it low-hanging fruit, but this one is one that you can account and assign fairly easily. I hope. You've got a list of equipment, you have equipment that you have on the farm, to start putting these inventories together of what the equipment is. I know that one of our family members has a large excavating business. So having the model, make, VIN number, insurance number, policy number, sort of in that one place is very helpful for tagging. It's helpful for insurance. It's helpful when creating the balance sheet. So counting and assigning those resources and equipment on the farm is very helpful. You can list out the assets. So those are the items that you own, and you can include in that type of chart, and I'll show some examples of what you owe or maybe what the balances are. And again, that helps to determine your net worth. So you can put together that balance sheet when you have those resources put together. It helps you look at non-cash expenses like depreciation. So if you've added new equipment, that's something that you would want to communicate with your accountant for, or your lender with, so that they can account for that asset and that purchase. And again, it assists with not just your taxes and insurance, like I mentioned, but also some purchasing decisions. So outlining some of the things that you have resources to. And I've even seen some and recommended some resource inventories to have, maybe if you have access to something. It might not be an asset, but it's something where you can rent or borrow or barter with a piece of equipment. So you kind of have that full idea of the resources and machinery on the farm. And I will say that, equipment is usually the second largest expense related to farms after land. So this is just an example of what some of these might look like. You might want to add, the original purchase price if you're still paying on it. Maybe it's who you have a loan through, who was the lender on that. Perhaps it includes like the serial numbers or the ID numbers. It's, the middle of winter and you're updating this and you don't want to be crawling in the back pole barn looking for VIN numbers or, trying to scratch off the mud from last year. So having it again in one place is very helpful. Be sure to include everything, machines, implements. Often the machine is included, but maybe not the implements that go along with it. And if you have some type of payment plan, some insurance agencies also recommend photos. So you might want to just take a couple snapshots, put that in your file if you need to, again, prove that to someone about that equipment. So these are two different ways. One is sort of a written, typed in fillable sheet. The other is done in Excel here. And it's just looking at, the cost of that and going through like how we could maybe divide out those equipment costs on a per year basis if we want to allocate those. And I talked a lot about equipment and machinery, but don't forget building and structure inventory. And also if you farm on a lot of parcels, you may want to do this as an inventory for the parcels as well. So I could see this almost if you've got an operation, you've got an Excel spreadsheet with a couple worksheets that have, equipment, maybe it's building and structures and facilities. And then the third is land. And that, land could include acreage, deed numbers, anything that you could assign to that. For building and structure inventory, it might also include the expense to build and make improvements. Again, it could include the contents of those. So what is generally stored in these areas, and some photos. And I will tell you, in the last 2 years, we've had some very major farm fires. We had a poultry house a couple of weeks ago. Last growing season, we had 2 individuals, one in my county, one in a neighboring county, that lost massive pole barns. And so they have said to me, I didn't even know what was in there. Like, I'm just realizing now things that I'm missing because I hadn't accounted for those. So maybe it's some photos that you take around, and that way if you did need to make some insurance claims, you've got some of those photos and can have that conversation. And then for business planning, one of the worksheets that we've done for records is maybe a wish list. And when we put together a case study a couple years ago, we created this, projected equipment purchasing schedule, especially for new and beginning farmers. You can't buy everything in year one. And for depreciation reasons, you probably don't want to do that because you want to kind of spread out some of those costs. So thinking about, where improvements might happen on the farm. So again, thinking that reflection and then that projection. And I think that that's a really good practice with all of your record keeping. But I think for resource inventories, trying to think what your wish list is. We like to do this improvement. This barn needs these things. Maybe we're going to run water. We're going to trench electric. Maybe it's just some of those activities that you want to try to plan for. One that has an expense related to it, and two that will help move your business forward. All right, so we're moving out of resource inventory into our production records. So these are our growing records. And I think sometimes to me, these are maybe the hardest to keep because you're in the middle of the growing season and trying to write down some of these things. And so to me, production records are probably the ones that are put on little notebooks in a pocket, or maybe I'm really good to text myself some information or data or some shorthand. So these really look at the measure and report of performance of your crop and livestock enterprises. So your crop records can include a couple different things: soil conditions, maybe your cropping patterns, field layouts, building locations, perhaps it's varieties, your yields, your fertilizer rates, your pesticide applications. Again, you can keep a lot of different records. I think it's figuring out what makes sense for your farm and what are records that you need to make good decisions. For livestock, breeding records are going to be very important. Perhaps it's feeding information, performance, mortality, all of those are kind of kept. Here in Maryland, we keep manure generated and how much bedding we put down, so we know how many nutrients are being accumulated on a farm. So those kind of records could be important. And then keeping labor records, and that's something that we find throughout farms, is that keeping records of how much time we're spending, especially when we create enterprise budgets and want to account for our labor time. How much time is required for the operation, and for people that want to maybe look into seasonal labor or hiring employees, having those records could be helpful in making those decisions. And again, there's multiple reasons for keeping these records: tax purposes, insurance purposes, regulations, pricing decisions, and production expenses. So we'll go through a couple examples here. And the first is sort of maybe a production plan. So maybe it's this time of year, I'm sitting down and I'm kind of putting together my production, marketing, and capital purchase plan, what's going on the farm in the months to come, and making sort of a production plan that way. Perhaps it's creating a cropping chart. And for those people that grow a lot of different types of vegetables, maybe it's putting something like this together for your CSA, so people know when your tomatoes might be ready or your broccoli will be on, and having sort of these Gantt charts. They're pretty easily created through like an Excel program, and visually they're very easy to look through. They work really great for your marketing side as well. For grain crops, I just wrapped up. I do some reporting for some family members that have commercial grain and poultry operations. And so here in Maryland, we need to keep records of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash that are applied to crops. And then we also keep, so this one up here in the top, the colored Excel chart is fertilizer used on farms, and we have to account for fertilizer as well as manure. And that's reported to the state. And then down here in the right-hand corner are weigh tickets. So these are, the number would be the ticket at the grain elevator, what farm it was off of, what crop it was, how many bushels were delivered, and what the price was. And I really love Excel because what I can do is then do a weighted average. So we can then put together, how many total bushels, what was the price, and then you can also look at yield. And again, these help make decisions maybe it helps reporting on a yearly basis, but then over the years, it helps make decisions on crop insurance coverage or yield goals, that type of thing. So this is just kind of a summary of what you may want to consider for production records. And I think one I did not talk about was, and we saw that as COVID was happening, and some of the things is for business continuity, keeping records even of vendors. And we really want to be able to share this. If I only have access to a computer password or this Excel file, can I share it with my other farm partners and people that are making decisions? So having perhaps even listing of who your customers are, how to get in touch with them. We found that even having a list of our contacts and how important that is to be able to reach out and have a summary of customers or your vendors. So again, this is an example of production records, and I put some ones down here on the bottom. I've seen poultry. I know dairies use a lot. May try to account for water usage. Maybe it's electric. Maybe it's temperature. Farms often will keep soil temperature, or you can look online at some of your local, I know like our extension publishes soil temperature. So trying to keep track of that over time. Maybe it's grain prices. So again, lots of different production records that can be kept for both growing and marketing. A little bit into projected and actual, because I've talked a lot about that reflection and then that planning and what happened. So I think that it's great to consider for production and for your financial records. So for your enterprise budgets and for cash flow statements. Projections are your future, and they also called pro forma. And this is where you can project income and expenses. It helps you determine your financial needs when you're meeting with lenders, when you're making big plans like putting up a pole barn or making an equipment purchase or an investment. You can use projections for that planning. It helps you to plan for contingencies. So when you look at what could be upcoming, especially the seasonality of farming, and then it helps monitor over time. The actual is the past and present tense, so what happened. And this is really important when we start looking at the cash flow statement. And then I really love that third statement, and that's reconcile. Pause and take time to reconcile. You reconcile your bank accounts, sit down and reconcile some of these projected and actual. The more you do this, the better the numbers get. And I know producers that I work with, especially beginning farmers, will say, well, how do I know what is going to happen? Well, you do have to make a best guess. And so in my mind, reconciling will help you make that decision moving forward. So what worked and what didn't, and making those changes and modifications as you go along. So this is just a production record that you could do. You could create a projected and an actual. So I want to sit down and I'm going to be talking to vendors. I'm going to be talking to restaurants. I'm going to be forward contracting my grain. I need to decide on what can I grow this year? What are my projections? How many acres am I putting in? What could be my expected yield? So this could be a chart that could have something like your projected cropping plan, your crops to be raised, acres planted, projected yield, and then you can start, again, as you see, you go through the columns, you can set maybe an expected selling price, then you could get a projected revenue. Again, making those projections this time of year. The same can happen with livestock. So maybe you are trying to scatter, processing, or maybe it's eggs, or maybe it's something that you're doing with livestock breeding stock, number to be sold, number purchased, and kind of going again through this chart to make those projected plans. And then you would come back, and instead of saying number to be sold, you would say number sold. And then, total number. And instead of expected selling weight, you would have selling weight. And then again, you can put these side by side and continue to make that reconciliation or those changes as needed. The last ones that I'm going to go into, so we've talked about resource inventories and that type of record keeping. We've talked about production records. Now we're going to go into financial records. And these are the ones, I think, when you think of record keeping, these are the ones we think about most, because we're keeping sort of that expense, income and expense piece. So financial records, I like to put these in the category. You've got the enterprise budgets. And again, this time of year is really great to create those budgets and think about what's coming up. The next is the financial statements. And these both are really being emphasized through the Know Your Numbers program, and looking at those financial statements much more in depth. I would also, as you're doing your research and you're looking at your record keeping, at least categorize your expenses by the IRS at a minimum, and take some time to look at the Farmer's Tax Guide. It's only like 200 and some pages, but it really is a very helpful guide to go through. Take a look at it, download it, flip through, especially things that may relate to your farm and your farm business. It gives you some insight into how to keep the records and how to categorize them, and what your accountant may need as they make decisions. And then print off, I like to print off the Schedule F. I recommend all beginning farmers definitely do that. Go to your Schedule F, print it off, look at the categories, look at what can and can't be claimed. And there's a really good description about the Schedule F. It's about 6 pages that outlines how to look at the Schedule F. And you may decide to break them down into additional categories. So I think I'm going to show some examples of that a little bit later, but an example in your Schedule F might just be feed. But we know that if you've got, especially if you've got a diversified livestock operation, you've got feed in a couple different categories, right? Maybe it's you've got your yearlings, or maybe you've got maintenance, or maybe you've got breeding stock feed, or maybe you want to do it by species. We also know insurance. You're covered insurance in a couple different ways. You probably have a number of different policies based on the type of home, farm, auto, medical, liability, crop insurance, any of those kind of things. So I would very much start with the Schedule F and then work backwards. So what is it that they need? And then break down some of those categories into things that will make you a good manager and be able to make good decisions on the farm. So that could be whether it's crop sales, whether it's, again, talking about insurance, talking about fuel. You may want to break those down into much smaller categories. So we're going to talk a little bit about accounting, and then we'll go into some of the financial records, and then we'll wrap up with talking about Excel and QuickBooks. So this is important because of the way we keep our financials. And in farming, we still keep, most people, majority use the cash method. And that's when you record the transaction, it's when it's actually laid out. And you record that. in the financial account when it happens. The accrual method is used by most businesses. It gives a great snapshot into the profit and loss, but it uses the accounts receivable and the accounts payable. And so it accords revenue when the actual transaction is completed, not when you receive the cash. So if I send a bill, I put it in accrual. If I'm using cash, I don't account for that accounts receivable until I cash the check. So that's a little bit of the difference there between cash and accrual. And this is important when you start creating some of the record keeping processes, especially if you're using financial software. So I mentioned already accounts receivable, there's accounts payable. So that includes money owed to a customer is your receivable. Accounts payable is money that you need to pay. And this is important, at least for farms, because that could go on your balance sheet in your current assets or your current liabilities is what you currently owe someone on the balance sheet. Assets and liabilities, as mentioned, assets are everything a company owns. And so again, having that equipment and that land inventory, knowing cash on hand, tools, anything. So it's those tangible assets, and then there's also the intangible. So that could be stock, any patents, anything that retirement, those kind of things can also fall into the asset category. Liabilities are debts, and that is a company's responsible to pay in the short or long term. So mortgages, loans, credit card debt, that type of thing, accounts payable. And then there's the general ledger, and that terminology is often used in our financial software as well as journal entry. So a general ledger is the complete recording of the company's financial transactions over the lifetime. So if I'm going to send my accountant this year's tax forms, I'm going to send him the accountant's copy of my general ledger. The journal entry is a record, so that's a business transaction in the accounting books of a business. And there's certain things that go into that journal entry. You need the date, the amount to be debited or credited, and a description of the transaction, and maybe a memo or some type of reference number to help you with that. So moving from accounting, those were just my two accounting slides, because I think in record keeping and when you start working on financials, doing a little bit of accounting, professional development, sitting in on some accounting classes would be very, very helpful, especially when they start talking about depreciation, they start talking about payroll. If you have that, will be very helpful to the manager of a business, whether it's a farm business, a home business, private industry. Moving into enterprise budgets, and these, I'm a big proponent of these. You can go out on the web and do a quick search of enterprise budgets. They would help you get sort of a template together. But I think this really looks at what you may be outlaying as far as variable cost and your fixed cost. And what this helps you do is plan for expenses related to a crop. It helps you plan for the quantity of yield and income. And it also helps you look at what monies you need to set, what you need to price a crop at. So this example are berries in year 2. We have 3 acres outside plus 1 in the house. This was our 2010 projections. And I can see that, where my break even is, and then where I need to start pricing the product at. All right. And I see I have a question about equipment or land. Is that in your name, but to set up a loan, is that an asset or liability? So that piece of equipment could be an asset and a liability, right? So it is, say you've purchased a tractor and your purchase price was $20,000. You put $5,000 down. So you can put that amount of that tractor is worth, but then you also put down what you still owe on that tractor. So an example of that would be the value of the tractor, and then you would still have what you have the tractor as a loan on. And the great thing about a balance sheet, I find it very rewarding to do these every year at kind of the same time, because you can see how your net worth can increase over time as you pay down debt, as you accumulate assets. So often, especially for equipment, assets and liabilities, especially if you have a loan for it or you still owe on it, it's in both places. So here's the farm financial statements, and the Know Your Numbers is going very much more in detail with each one of these three. And so how to not only create them, but make good decisions based on them. And we've got a couple balance sheets out. This is a case study where you can see that we've got different types of income and expenses here. Assets and liabilities. And I really wanted to highlight the cash flow example because you see these numbered down here, the inflow and the outflow. And just like your Schedule F, these are impossible to create without some kind of record. And I'll use maybe line, you need your labor information to complete line 13. You need your production costs to complete line 8, 9, and 10. We would need a marketing budget to complete line 18. So while these are pretty round numbers because it was a case study and it made math easier, having that background and those spreadsheets and records, it really is impossible to create these balance sheets and these cash flow statements without some type of records to go back to and to reference, because these again are big lump categories. All right, so I'm moving out of sort of the records to keep and some examples into managing record keeping. So managing farm records, again, so many types of records can be kept. You really need to make decisions on what records are necessary and those that are helpful to your farm business. You definitely need to figure out a way to organize them, something that's quick, easy to use during the growing season. This time of year, you're putting together financials. So I want to be able to access my information, put those reports together for my accountant or my lender or my insurance agent. So some ways to do that. There's some computer options with Microsoft templates, Excel, Quicken or QuickBooks, some apps that are out there, and there's other farm software that have hit the market. So I'll just show some examples. I love anybody that used the Microsoft suite. I love their templates, and a lot of them are customizable. They can help you create invoices. They can create timesheets. They're all already done. I've seen them in Word. I've seen them in Excel. Then you can modify them as needed. So I would highly recommend going into the Office templates if you have the Office suite to kind of look at those, or at least see how they've created those. My favorite is Excel. I do like Excel, even for simple calculations. Sometimes I'll use my phone, but I like to be able to outline it in Excel. I also like the ability to correct, to check my work. So, back in school, you had a way to do your math and then you can check your work, because sometimes an extra zero or something can get entered incorrectly. So I do like being able to do some, I find that in Excel, I can do some double checking very easily that way. I think it's a good way to get organized. You can use formulas in there, and then there's graphing. So I just wanted to share some things that I do. I don't always remember the formulas, so I love the help. I use count a lot. So if I want to know how many things, how many X's are in this column, or How many times did I say a certain thing? I use weighted averages a lot, especially for green marketing. And I also like percentage change. So if I want to know like what the difference was in last year to this year, I can do percentage change. And I'll often have to look those up. I like to create a workbook with worksheets. And I have some workbooks that have massive sheets within them. And so an example might be that I call mine resource inventories. And then I have all of these worksheet tabs in there. They're super easy to copy from one year to another or to update. And so I really like to do that. And you can see this second bar here. This is an example of a class we had, and we just started adding year after year. So instead of creating a whole new file that doesn't have data together, I can put them together into worksheets and then have a summary tab. So just as I said a little bit about accounting professional development, I think if you think Excel might be helpful to you, taking some time and doing some of the tutorials would be really, really helpful in designing these worksheets and making them work for you. So this example here, I can click on the summary and I can create a summary of all of these years together. So the copy functions, again, I find very helpful. I also like the filter functions. So I'll create headers and then I'll create a filter and then I can just move things around. So maybe I want to look by date and then I want to look by crop and then I want to look by farm. So I can do that with the filter functions. And then again, I love graphing. If you start to get data over time, you can kind of create a set and you can look at a graph and kind of make some decisions visually that way. So you've heard my love of Excel, but I also have used QuickBooks and Quicken. These are probably the most popular financial record keeping software. They do have farm related financial statements and activities in there. And so it'll help manage if you're doing any invoicing, manage accounts payable and receivable. There are certain versions that have payroll features. If you have private contractors and have to send out 1099s, these are very helpful to keep records. It does have your Schedule F in there. So you can start labeling expenses as, in those Schedule F categories. One of the things that I think are really beneficial is the ability to reconcile and produce reports. So with good information created, you can click on a couple buttons and all of a sudden you have a balance sheet, you have a cash flow statement, you have all of that information. All of those Excel spreadsheets that I showed before is really at the click of a button if you've been entering them into this financial accounting software. It will write checks for you. It will generate lists of vendors and customers. It is cloud-based now, so you can access it via your phone, or if you're out in the field or at a remote location. It does now integrate with a lot of your, like if you're point of sale, if you're using that, or your vendors. So that helps as well as connecting with your bank accounts and your credit card accounts. You can import those expenses. So this is kind of an old snapshot of what it looks like. Every year, QuickBooks gets prettier and prettier when you open it up and you've got this kind of QuickBooks map. I think it can be overwhelming. I think the thing to know when you open it up, there is a big abandonment rate with these financial software. People buy it, they have great intentions, and then they're overwhelmed. I would say start small and know that a lot of this you may not even end up using if you're not maybe selling online, or you don't want to use, like there's some marketing tools on here. This is just all the bells and whistles. You also have tabs. You can access one piece in 3 different ways. So there's a chart of accounts here, but you can click in the bar up top. And so I think it can be overwhelming because there's lots of different ways to get to the same screen. I would just highlight on here the chart of accounts. That one is the one that you would start with. as you're creating your business. And there's kind of a wizard that would step you through QuickBooks. So again, you would look at an overview. When we do our class, we kind of set up a chart of accounts. We set up a business. We itemize things. We create items and classes. We go through depositing. We go through receiving and paying bills, reconcile a bank statement. And then if you do have payroll, QuickBooks definitely makes that very easy. So, you know, if you were going to step through using QuickBooks, there's certain steps that you need to do. Again, some great tutorials out there if this is something that you think that you need to start for your business. And there are some things that you would need to get started. You would need to reconcile your bank accounts. Really what you would do is get all of your accounts straight and organized for 2021. And you would start QuickBooks opening at 2022. It looks like we have a question. Do you still have to do a ledger if you have everything in QuickBooks? So QuickBooks would create the ledger for you. So it would create a bank account. You would set up your bank account and you would tell it what your general categories of accounts are. So you would have a chart of accounts. And then your journal entry is when you start to write checks and make your payments. And so again, I don't really have a recommendation on the threshold of your farm, but I do think there's a threshold that Excel kind of works until a certain point. And then, you know, you do need to move to maybe a better financial record keeping software. So yeah, you would definitely do, you wouldn't need to do, say, a checkbook ledger. You would have that on QuickBooks if you set that up. Again, just like I mentioned in Excel, QuickBooks has a great help features, tutorials. You can check with your accountant if you have someone that you work with. They might have a QuickBooks Pro on staff and they can help you get things set up, or at least if you get it set up, they can take a look at it. The new accountant's copies are very easy to send to your accountant. They can make the changes for you. And so, again, I think that's something you definitely have to decide to be committed to it. But once you get it set up, it definitely will keep the financial record keeping organized. And then this is just an example. This was, I think, the example of a construction company. They have a couple of sample businesses in the QuickBooks software. But what you can see is there are some, like the automobile, it has insurance, fuel and repairs. It has different, you can set up subcategories. So you can put in fixed assets, you can put in your income accounts, and you can put in your expense accounts. So this is just an example of what a chart of accounts might look like. Moving out of QuickBooks and the financial record keeping software, there are some apps. Play and iTunes Store have lots of different ones out there. Thisfarms.com used to have a great list of apps. I think they were up to 500 at one point. I was looking at that. I have to be honest, no one notebook, folder, software, or app have I found that will meet all your needs. I have not seen a one and done software. They've tried, there's some different types of software out there now that are trying to do mapping plus yield plus financial plus record keeping. Most of it is some type of mix of written and electronic. And then perhaps it's an app and an Excel or a QuickBooks. So I would say there's definitely no one out there that will meet all of it or do all things that we talked about today. Just a couple reminders to be sure to back up, whether you use a USB, you want to do it on a regular basis and you want to store it off site. So an example is here at the office, I back up, I take a copy home. At home, I back up, I take a copy to the office. And I think that's really an important practice to have those things separated. If you're going to back up to the cloud, just make sure you have some security measures set in place. And just some other considerations. We had an accountant, someone asked them, how often do you back up? And he said, well, how many transactions do you have that you would want to recreate the data? So if something happened today, is it 2 weeks you want to go back, 6 months you want to go back? So think about that in having to recreate whatever was last backed up. So, maybe it's monthly, maybe it's weekly, maybe it's every 2 months. We used to say a designated computer in farm management. I'm not sure that's as much the case anymore, especially because of cloud systems, but I still know a lot of farmers. My very good friend has a poultry farm and she has one computer that no one touches but her. No kids, no other family members. That's what the poultry houses are tied to. That's what our financials are tied to. And no one gets to go on there surfing on some kind of site to get, I don't even know that she gets on the internet other than to do like QuickBooks updates and computer updates. It's not somewhere where she searches and browses for because of risk of security and viruses. And then have some kind of system for saving and naming. And I probably should put on there sharing too, so people can access it. So you're saving it, is it saving it by the date? A lot of times if I do an enterprise budget, maybe it's, I just did my grain crops. So it's grain crops and I use today's date, 3_3_22. So I know what that date was when it was last updated. And I think that's a great way to have some kind of naming system in place. So what is the most recent version. And with that, that is it for today. I'll ask if there's any questions. And again, I'll be sharing the slides. I think thinking about what records to keep and what type of management best makes sense for you, whether you're in the field, maybe what your computer experience is or your comfort level.
And we have one last poll for you. So if you could respond to this, and while you're responding, maybe if people have questions for Shannon in the chat, please. And Shannon's included her email address. Thank you, Shannon, for, the hour has gone past quickly, hasn't it? So if there are any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. I think some people might be wondering, well, what do I do if I don't have, if I live on a farm and I do my record keeping in the house, or, where's that alternative location? But even keeping it in a separate building on your farm, if you don't have an office to go to, you could keep, one set, if you don't have a farm office outside your house, maybe you could keep it in your shop or somewhere else. So there's different options. I know I keep a set of records with a trusted friend because I figure if a tornado or some horrible thing happens, at least I won't have to recreate everything I have.
Yeah, I haven't invested in a safety deposit box. I've said for a couple of years I was going to do that because I know that's one of the recommendations too, is to have a safety deposit box. And the big discs that you can save things on, I know the USBs don't hold a lot, but I also like to back up my photos. I think that would be one of the things that I would be most devastated in losing are my photos.
I use in addition, I'm really kind of concerned about losing data. So I keep things in the cloud, but I also have external hard drives, and I just bought a new 5 terabyte one to hold a bunch of things because my 2 terabyte one is full now. So I think, those are a good investment. All right. Well, we've got sharing the results here of our poll. So somebody said that they're ready to take on the world here, Shannon. And people could respond to more than one thing, but it looks like people are more confident, which is terrific, and have a better understanding. And fortunately, they're not less confident after taking this, be participating in this session. So again, thank you everyone for participating today. We will be holding these weekly during this this month of March. So please, it's National Ag Week is this month. It's Women's History Month. There's all kinds of great things happening. And there's also these wonderful webinars that you can take advantage of. Next week, we do have an introduction to the cost accounting program that Dr. Robin Brumfield has put together from Rutgers Cooperative Extension. We're excited to have Robin with us next week. And that's a really useful program. If you haven't been exposed to that before, please do sign up for that because I think you'll find that really valuable.